Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Founded in Grace's Fig Chats. It's great to be together. Wonderful to take the time to be able to sit down and talk to different people about different things. And today, our special guest is none other than John Rawlinson, who comes all the way from the UK. He is joining us early in the morning, and for Geoff and I, it's late. Of course, you know Geoff and I'm the pastor up here at Covenant, and Geoff's all the way down in the glorious town of Wyndham. Geoff, great to be with you again, brother. John, why don't you introduce us to yourself, tell us who you are and why you've joined us.
Okay, well, thanks, Logan. Thanks for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. You already know my name. I'm John Rawlinson. I'm the General Manager of the Banner of Truth Trust. So that means that I'm responsible essentially for the work of the Banner worldwide. I'm based in Edinburgh, which is where our headquarters is. Those of you who are good with accents may already know that if you've heard Geoff speak, I'm sure you've been listening to this and watching Geoff, you'll know he's not English. He has a bit of an accent, and you may know that I'm not Scottish, although I'm based in Scotland, but I am English originally, but I now live and work in Scotland. Do you want to talk a bit about the Banner of Truth itself? Yeah. Okay. So some of you may have heard of the Banner, perhaps some of you haven't, but the Banner of Truth has been around since the late 1950s. So we're not young in the in the world in that sense. And what we do is, first of all, what we're best known for is publishing books. Then there are other things that we do. So we organise some ministers' conferences. In the UK, we also organise a youth conference. So we have a conference for ministers in the UK, two in the States as well, and every couple of years we have one in Australia. The other thing that we do is a monthly magazine. So that, in fact, was the first thing that Banner of Truth started off doing. So that was 1955 when the first edition of the magazine was produced. When that was done, the people who produced that first edition were not quite sure if there'd be a second edition or a third edition. And so it was done without any real vision of what the future would hold for the magazine. But after a short space of time, it did become a monthly magazine, and it continues today as a monthly magazine. So those are the core parts of what we do: publishing books, organising conferences, and the monthly magazine. There's another aspect of what we do, though, which is actually a very important part of what we do, which is a thing called our book fund. And the book fund was started in the early 1960s. If some of your watchers and listeners are familiar with Spurgeon and Mrs. Spurgeon in particular, they may well know the story of Mrs. Spurgeon's book fund and how she was getting books and sending them out to pastors who perhaps couldn't afford to buy them. And one of our members of staff had been reading that story and said, "Oh, that's a great idea. We should do that." And so the Banner of Truth Book Fund was started in the early 60s, and we ship books all over the world to whether it be pastors, missionaries, seminaries, individual Christians who perhaps are in difficult circumstances and can't afford to buy books. And that's a big part of what we do. It's an important part of what we do. And as I say, we have things going just all over the world week by week.
Mm. It's exciting. It's exciting to have you here, John, and an opportunity to ask you questions. And Logan said before we started, Banner's played a significant part in both of our lives, and it really has for me. It wasn't something that I encountered until going to university, but particularly when I got very serious about my faith, and especially when I was beginning to consider ministry. Banner of Truth was a massive help to me because it was a publishing house that was reliable, and so I could go through a secondhand Christian book shop and I could run my eyes along the shelf, and I might not know who all of the authors are or what they're writing about, but if I saw that little picture of, it's George Whitfield, isn't it, on the bottom of the spine, or the words Banner of Truth, I knew that was worth putting in my bag, because I knew that what Banner published was good. And it's great to have that, especially when you're first, as I say, kind of getting serious about your faith, to be able to know this is a publishing house I can really trust. And so I want to ask you, why books? Why are books so important? And I also want to throw in a little bonus question: is why George Whitfield? Why is Whitfield the the man of Banner.
Okay. Well, why books? That I think is an easy one. I mean, you almost said it for me, didn't you? You know, when you were growing in the faith and you're a young Christian, what were you doing? You were looking for books, and you were looking for books. So you went into a bookshop and you were looking for the books with a little man on the back of it. That's not a lone story. So a friend, somebody who I knew when he was very youngly converted. He was converted from a very much a non-Christian background. He had very little exposure to the gospel growing up. He would have been, I guess, in his early to mid-20s. He worked in a manual job. He was not particularly well educated. He'd left school at 16. And he got to a point in his Christian life where he felt that he needed to grow, and he didn't know what to do. And he went and talked to somebody at his church. And he said to him, look, I don't quite know what to do here. He said, you know, I'm not very able, but I can read. He said, so I think I'd like to read. And the gentleman encouraged him to read. So he went to a Christian bookstore, and he told me that he walked in and he had a look around. And I thought this is where it actually becomes very interesting. He showed significant discernment, actually, because he looked around, he turned around, he walked out again. And I said to him, well, why did you walk out? He said, well, because I went in and I had no idea what to read. He said, and I realized as I looked around, there could be things in here that might be harmful to me. Now, this was me having a conversation with this young man who I'd known for some years, but had lost contact with. Had happened to visit the city that I knew he'd now moved to and was living in. And I was sitting now in his living room, having looked him up and gone and connected with him. As I sat there, I could see across the room was a bookshelf, and it was full of books. And the majority of the books on there were Banner books, and some of them were serious books. Yeah. And that was not what I'd remembered of him. And I was asking him basically, have you read those books? And he would say, yeah, I've read every one of those books. So what happened was he went back to one of the elders at his church and said, look, I've had this experience. I don't know what to read. And the man said, come with me. And he took him across to a place in the church where they had a bit of a church library. And he pointed to the little Whitfield on the back. And he said, look, when you go into the bookshop, look for that. He said, and if you start off just getting books with that on the back of it, you won't go far wrong. And that's what he did. And for several years, that's all he did was buy and read Banner books. He's actually now in the ministry, and I know he reads things other than Banner books, but he's now built that level of knowledge and discernment that he can make his own decisions, so to speak. So that I think sums up in a sense why we do books, because they can change people's lives. That young man went from really a relatively uneducated individual to a Christian who wanted to grow in his Christian faith, who did grow in his Christian faith, and ultimately went into the ministry. There's loads of other stories that I could tell you. I'll just, have we got any restrictions on time? No. No, great. Okay.
Not for you, only for us.
Yeah, you need to get to bed, don't you?
Yeah, you can carry on. We'll just leave on record.
So I'll tell you another story. It was some years ago in America. I was at an exhibition, and there was a gentleman who walked by, and he stopped as he walked past, and he looked at our booth there, and he pointed to a book that was on the wall, and he said, that book you've got up there, he said, that book changed my life. And of course, that's just a red flag to me. I'm like, oh, come on, come and sit down, come and talk to me, tell me all about it. So he did. And it was the Lloyd Jones, it's a tiny little book actually, Lloyd Jones Authority. And I said to him, well, how did that change your life? He said, well, I was in a church. He was the minister, in fact, in a church. And he said, I couldn't sleep one night. And I got up and I went down into my study, said I got myself something to drink. And he said, I sat down and I thought, you know what, I'll read something because that might help me to get back to sleep. So he said, I looked around my shelves. He said, I saw that little book. He said, I don't know where I got it from, but it was sitting on the shelf. It looked a small book. So I thought, well, I'll read that. I've never read that. He said, so I picked that off my shelf thinking it could perhaps help me get to sleep. He said, what a mistake that was. He said, I started reading. I couldn't stop reading until I'd finished it. He said, and having finished it, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't go back to bed, he said, because what I came to realize and understand was that much of what our church stood for and much of what I was preaching week by week was not right. He said, and I was convicted by this. I said, over a period of a few weeks, he said, it drove me to study more. And he came to Reformed convictions. But the problem was that wasn't where his church stood. And again, over a few more weeks, he got to a position where he felt, I can't stay in my church. This wouldn't be right. I now believe something different to what our church believes. So rather than just sort of give his notice in, so to speak, he asked his elders and deacons to meet him. And he said they all sat in this room together. And he said, I told them that I wanted to explain something to them because it was very important. He said, so he explained what had happened. He explained what he now believed the scriptures taught. And he ended by saying, as a result of this, I don't feel it would be right for me to continue ministering in this church. And he said, he looked around the room. He said, there was a silence to start with. He said, and then one of his elders, who was actually an elderly gentleman, said, well, Pastor, he said, for some little while, I've been wondering about some of these things myself. So I'd like to make a suggestion. I suggest that you stay and that you preach these things and teach these things to us as a church, and we'll reassess the situation at some point in the future. And that's what he did. And when I was speaking to him, this was some years later, and I believe he was still in the same church. The church themselves reformed during the course of a period of time in preaching and teaching.
Wow.
So books change lives. And that's why we're passionate about books. That's why we do what we do. They can be instrumental in people's conversion, and there are no end of stories where people have been converted as a result of things they read. Some things that are most unusual, things that you wouldn't think of as an evangelistic piece of literature. Again, I could go on all day giving you stories here, but I'll just give you one more. An example of something that I certainly wouldn't have thought of as evangelistic literature, and that's the biography of Martin Lloyd-Jones that was written by Ian Murray, the 2 volumes. But I met a gentleman on one occasion. He was a Welshman, and he told me that book had been, or those 2 books had been instrumental in his conversion. And what had happened was, it was a friend of his who was a Christian who had said to him, had been trying to get him to read some Christian books, and he was having none of it, not having any of it. But he said to him, well, and you're Welsh, and I know that you're proudly Welsh, and we all know Welsh people can get quite proud of their roots. And he said, so how about reading this book? He said, it's a story of a Welshman, and he was a very well-known Welshman. So how about reading this book? And this man agreed, okay, he would read that book because it was about a Welshman. But in the course of reading that book, he was actually at the shops with his wife. Perhaps he should have been in the shop with his wife, but he wasn't. He was sitting in his car while his wife was in the shops, and he was reading the book. And as he read the book, he became very much convicted of sin. And he found himself out of the car, kneeling down on the car park, kneeling in the car park, praying that God would save him. And he was converted. And shortly afterwards, his wife was converted too. But his wife came out of the supermarket to find this man in a different state to the way he was when she went into the supermarket. And as I say, in time, she too was converted. So that's why we do it. Books can convert, books can help people to grow in grace. Books, I think, for anybody who's in the ministry, they're essential tools too. And that's why we do books. You asked about Whitfield, I think.
Yeah.
To be honest, I'm not actually sure what the origin of our Whitfield logo is. And in many ways, I guess Whitfield sort of sums up who we're about and what we're about. Theologically, Whitfield would be on the page that we're on. Whitfield obviously was very much well known as a preacher. And again, one of the things that the banner has always sought to do is to try to help ministers. That's one of their primary targets in terms of what we publish. It's not the only, they're not the only people we're seeking to serve, but certainly one of the primary groups of people we're seeking to serve. So again, Whitfield very much embodies that kind of ethos.
I always got the sense of that evangelistic spirit at the core of Banner as well. It wasn't as much as there's value in the information and the informing, but transformation is at the heart of what Banner was about as well. It's publishing the gospel as much as publishing facts about history or just theology. And but yeah, no, it's interesting to hear.
Yeah, I think you're right, Geoff. I mean, if we publish a book that is just purely factual, then I think we're missing the point. It's a bit like preaching, isn't it? When you stand to preach to a congregation, what are you doing? You're not trying to teach them some facts, are you? If you were trying to do that, then you would be teaching, you wouldn't be preaching. So, if you wanted to teach a group of people about the Reformation, you could sit down and you could do that. And you could teach them certain facts, and you could give them dates, and you could give them people's names, and you could explain why this happened and why that happened.
Yeah.
But when they leave the room, what do they know? They just know some more information, but has it done anything? Has it changed them? And surely, when you're preaching, you're looking to, yes, sure, you're addressing people's minds, but the whole point is to change the will, isn't it? And change the heart.
And I think the authors who've contributed, they've got that passion for the gospel at the heart of why they're writing. That's there, isn't it? Ian Murray will have had in mind to put down a biography of Lloyd Jones that is evangelistic in nature as well, because that's reflective of his life. Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly in the case of Lloyd Jones, I think it was his wife who said, you cannot understand my husband until you realise that at heart he's an evangelist. And that was Bethany Lloyd Jones's view of her husband. And that would be true of our books too. We seek to publish things that do change lives, that do have that evangelistic thrust, but also that evangelical thrust, which is perhaps slightly different. But yeah, so we, and you see that Ian Murray is a good example. You read Ian's historical works, you don't get dry history with Ian. You get theology through history with Ian. He's looking to, get a message across. He's kind of preaching to you almost in the books as he writes. So things like revival and revivalism. It's not just documenting of what went on in that particular period of American church history. It's very much a plea, in a sense, for a true view of revival and a true view of the work of the Spirit, and how that works in terms of the way that God builds the church.
One of the things that always strikes me about the Banner, especially as I compare it to other publishing houses, is just the completely different approach that it feels to have, in the sense that when you look at other publishers, it's all about the new, it's all about fancy, it's all about, dressing things up, or it's all about the new mediums, Spotify, everything else. Whereas when we turn to the Banner, one of the things that always strikes me is, like right now, the celebration of the publication of the Puritans again. And there just seems to be this overarching stress upon really good stuff that's been written in the past, as opposed to panicking about the new and fanciful. What is it about the sort of Puritans especially, but the older writers, that is such a driving force for you?
Yeah, I remember a few years back, there was a survey done in the States on books and the publication of new books. And at the time, the survey said that in a bookstore, the average life of a new title was about 2 to 3 weeks. Now, what they meant by that was that a new book had 2 to 3 weeks for sitting face out on the shelf. So you could see the whole cover. 2 to 3 weeks later, it got turned, and then all you ever saw was the spine. And that was the shelf life. And if you look at publishing in general, there is a slightly longer shelf life in a sense from a publisher's perspective for a book. It's not 2 or 3 weeks, it's a bit longer than that. But even so, it is a relatively short period of time. So publishers, certainly in the secular world, publishers will publish a book. The initial sales are the big thing. By the time you get to a year on, 2 years on, it's remaindering into the book clubs. And that's the model of publishing. And that model becomes self-perpetuating. So if you want to grow your business, you have to do more and more new books. And you have to have, a body of perhaps, I don't know, depends how many a year you're publishing, but let's say you publish 100 books a year and you pick 1 or 2 of those that you really promote and push, because they're the ones that are going to be the really big sellers this year. They're the ones you're going to make all your money off, and the others, in a sense, almost cannon fodder to cover your costs. And that's a model that, to some extent, has come into Christian publishing as well. But that's not a model that we follow. We recognize, and we do new books. We recognize there is a need to continue publishing. So we do new books. We do probably between sort of 22 to 28 new titles every year. But when we're publishing a book, we're looking for something that's got longevity. So if we're publishing a book today, in principle, this is an overall principle rather than talking specific books, because there are some specific books that will be a little bit different to this. But in principle, we're looking to publish something that is relevant today, but in 100 years' time will still be relevant to the church. So that's what we're looking for when we publish a book. And if you then think about what we have published, there's a sense in which that view of new titles is what's driven us from day one. Because what we've done is we've gone back in church history and we've published a lot of books that were out of print for many years. So, some of the things that we publish today were written in, say, the 1600s, some even earlier than that. And, they were written in such a way that they're still relevant today, because what they're dealing with is eternal truths. And the writers knew that they were scriptural men, they were biblical men, they were men who were filled with the Spirit, who wrote things that were applicable to their situation they were in. But because they were essentially working, shall we say, from principles rather than from particular issues, those biblical principles apply in every age. God is the same God today as he was in the 1500s, the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s. He's the same God. The Bible is the same Bible. So if you have things which are well written and written with insight into scriptural truths, then that they're as applicable now as they will be in 100, 200 years in the future, and as they were 100, 200, 300 years before today. I think in terms of authors, I don't believe we should just say because it's old, it's good. So let's be clear about that. Just because it's an older author doesn't make it right. But there are periods in church history where God, I think, was particularly at work. And sometimes those periods have generated literature. Not always, but sometimes they've generated literature. And where they have generated literature, it tends to be the better literature. So, if you look at the Puritan period and some of the people who we publish, the likes of sort of John Owen, John Flavel, these sorts of people, look at the kind of period of time in history that they lived. It was a tremendous time of turmoil in many ways. And they lived through periods of time when they were persecuted, periods of time when they had freedom, and the changes that came with that. And it brought an urgency, I think, sometimes to the message. And it certainly brought with it a need to have a thorough understanding of the scriptures, to be able to apply those principles into what was happening in the daily life. We sometimes think about, our own lives, the changes that are taking place in our own lives. We think life is changing, the society is changing rapidly, but look at that period in the sort of mid 1600s in England, where some of these men lived, and look at what went on. You're talking about civil war in England. You're talking about, mass ejections, 1662, mass ejections of evangelicals out of churches. You're talking about things like the 5 Mile Act, where men were put out of their churches and weren't allowed to preach within 5 miles of towns that sent people up to Parliament and so on. And lots of things happened then. It was a time of massive change. And then you get a little bit later on and you get the Glorious Revolution. And all of a sudden, from being a situation where men couldn't preach and men were being thrown out of pulpits, where you had a battle going on for, are we going to be a Catholic country or a Protestant country? All these sorts of things, you get to a point all of a sudden, oh, hey, you can go out and you can preach, and you can preach the gospel. And there was an urgency, I think, that came with that in people's writings. And I think that comes across with some of the Puritan writings. The environment they lived in, the situation they lived through, it drove these men to scripture, I think. And God was at work in that period. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that the times when God is especially at work, and we do see that, don't we? There are times where God is clearly, particularly at work. Those times often drive literature. Again, look at the Reformation. What's one of the maybe one of the must-read books of our time still, Calvin's Institutes. Where did that come from? That came from the Reformation period. Again, a time when God was at work and it drove the literature. So that I think perhaps helps to explain a little bit why we publish a lot of older authors. It's because of, the way they wrote and the content of what they wrote, and it's still very much applicable today.